Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome again to Syriana Analysis. I'm your host, Kevork Almassian. Thank you very much for tuning in to today's live streaming. I appreciate you all, guys, whether you're watching on YouTube or on Rumble. NATO countries are considering sending ground troops to Ukraine. And therefore, I talked today to Nina Byzantina to bring some historical context to this issue and whether the doomsday clock is ticking closer to Europe. Nina Byzantina is an independent political analyst. She holds a Ph.D. in history, and she focuses on modern and contemporary Russia and the US foreign policy. Nina, thank you so much for being with me today in this live streaming. I really appreciate that you dedicated this time for me and for the audience of Syriana to put this conflict, to bring some context and especially historical context to this conflict, which in my opinion is missing in the Ukraine war. Something I tried to do it. I'm touching on it, let's say, and I'm receiving some, contradicting comments. And I truly believe in freedom of the person to agree or disagree with me. Therefore, I would like to elaborate on some of the things that they disagreed with me, some of the audiences, because you have the experience in this. So thank you again.
Thank you for having me again. It's been a while, my fellow band alternative journalist.
And guys, finally, I've been blocked by Jordan Peterson, just for you to know today.
For reasons unknown to me.
apparently he's blocking, as Nina noted today, my followership, those who are commenting or following me. It's crazy.
Make sure you checked whether you also have this new badge of honor added to your all the other badges that you may have by now. So.
Yeah, I felt very naive in the past for, listening to some of his stuff. But now lessons are learned because, in my opinion, what happened in the Gaza Strip is a compass for me to see where is the moral compass of each person. And it's clear that Jordan lost his compass, unfortunately. And it's not only Jordan who lost the compass. Many in the West, I would argue, they lost the compass, especially after the hot war between Russia and Ukraine in February 2022. And I'm a person, I come from the Middle East. I have an ethnic Armenian background, so I studied also Middle Eastern politics. I don't know much about the complex history of the European continent and especially inner European relationships. So when the hot war, let's say, erupted in 2022, I saw clear Russophobia among many of the people, whether in Germany or outside Germany. I don't know the percentage. This is just my subjective opinion about it. But it was clear, for example, they started banning Russian culture, Russian language, Russian athletes, Russian football, basketball teams from competitions. They don't do the same thing, for example, for Israel, that is now accused of committing genocide, which shows you the true colors of these the countries who are claiming to champion human rights, etc., etc. So I don't want to address much what is Russophobia or not. Everybody knows it, but I want to know the context, why there is Russophobia in, for example, in Europe. And I found that during World War II, there were some of the countries that I naively thought that they all bravely fought against Nazi Germany. Some of them were actually very much
bravely fought for Nazi Germany.
Actually, they were very much in the same bed with Nazi Germany, and they were helping Nazi Germany, whether with steel, with iron. The bankers in the United States, they were giving loans and money to back then Hitler, of course, to continue his operations against the Soviets. And then when they realized that the pace of the hostilities is not going in the same direction that they have hoped for, they joined the war in a later stage in this war on the side of the USSR. It was called the Allies. Now we are in 2024. The Estonian Foreign Ministry, I think you saw this tweet. I just want to screen it again to the people because it was very hilarious, and I almost ratioed them on their Twitter account. They say today, 80 years ago, Tallinn is also, by the way, an Armenian name, was devastated by the March bombings, which destroyed a quarter of the city overnight. Up to 300 Russian aircrafts were bombing us, and their primary targets were residential districts and cultural landmarks. Russian playbook is the same today. Of course, they don't mention here at all that Estonia was under the control of Nazi Germany. And I commented Russia was bombing us 80 years ago indicates that you endorsed the Nazis in Estonia during World War II, or am I missing something? And this is an important point to focus on, in my opinion, is when you read this tweet made by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Estonia, somebody wrote it, somebody checked it, and somebody approved it to be published.
On top of that, that's not the only official statement like this. We've seen a similar statement coming from Polish officials a couple of months ago, where they also left out that slightly crucial piece of information about the Soviet Union moving westward to push out Nazi Germany, and the verbiage was very similar about the Russian playbook, the violence of it, but leaving out the fact that this was part of the Russian operation to push out Nazi Germany and go all the way to Berlin. So Estonia is not the country that has made such statements. And of course, we want to differentiate between the government and the people. Some people might be more hostile to Russians than others, but it is very noteworthy that there seems to be this coordinated campaign of making statements that are about pretty recent history. And I would say, people, even sort of the proverbial man on the street, does know about World War II and may hopefully know what was happening in 1944, at least from the standpoint of the Western Allied involvement that came a few months later with the Normandy landings, right? And then, of course, the USSR and the Western Allies, the Americans, they linked up somewhat later, and the war was won in May 1945 in Europe. So the fact that they would be leaving out easily confirmed information in this really cheap attempt to gaslight the public with this really crude ideological parallel that doesn't quite work, I think is really telling. That it seems to be, again, not a single official, like you're saying, someone decided to post this, someone proofread it, someone actually posted it. The fact that it's not the only occurrence is very, very telling. And the fact that they really don't seem to care about the veracity of the information, and that they would just completely leave out the context, really does speak volumes about their intentions, which is, of course, why you decided to look into the history of the Baltic in World War II. And usually that history, at least from their perspective, so we're talking about specifically Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, right? Modern day states that are independent. I mean, I like to think of them as sort of informal colonies of the global hegemon, whether you want to think of the global hegemon as a certain country in North America or as the Euro-Atlantic elites. They like to call themselves Euro-Atlantic. It doesn't ultimately matter. I consider these countries to be sort of informal colonies. They're formally, of course, independent, but informally they have a very, very different status. But be that as it may, the fact that these countries are using this type of ideological verbiage today is very, very telling. So how far back in history would you like me to go? I don't want to pull a Putin on you and go back to the 11th to the 11th.
Actually, this is the important point here was from the Estonian side that they took this context out of the tweet, right? Mm-hmm. So there is something called history revisionism. Mm-hmm. And the people are asking me, why now? Why in 2024, when this war erupted with Russia, there is this attempt to delegitimize the past of the USSR, let's say, and later can we consider the Russian Federation as a successor of the USSR nowadays?
It is the legal successor. It's the successor that actually had to pay all the debts of all the republics, including the Baltics, and only recently did the modern Russian Federation pay up all those debts. Right? This is it's also a very interesting component of the dissolution of the USSR that not a lot of people talk about. But yeah, we can talk about the Russian Empire as being the predecessor of the Soviet Union, and then modern Russia as being the successor, the legal successor of the USSR. Now, of course, there are ideological differences, but generally it's a similar, right, political entity in the same region. So I don't really personally have a problem of thinking of it as sort of the same state, roughly speaking, because I like to look at our history as as a continuum that had highlights, and it has some negative things too, which I think is a very reasonable way of looking at any country's history. But specific to these three Baltic states, they usually try to focus on the Soviet period. And as far as World War II goes, the way they present it as this were these small people, right? Small, well, today they're independent countries, but let's say small ethno-linguistic groups, right, in the Baltic, that found themselves to be amidst this clash of the two totalitarian empires. This is how they officially present themselves. And so there are some obvious problems with this presentation. So let's dissect it. So first of all, when you are comparing and equating, drawing a big fat equal sign between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union, that is problematic because ideologically, they were obviously different. If you look at the ideology of Nazi Germany, there was that sort of biological hierarchic racism at its core, ranking people in that particular hierarchy, right? Italian fascism was a little bit different. It was more about the state was the focal point. But let's look at the Soviet Union. That was not the focal point of the Soviet Union. It was more about class-based egalitarianism. And so, yes, you can say there are some features that are similar in terms of having the level of state control that each of these two states had, in terms of having, level of censorship, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But when you look at that specific sort of historical subject, they are very different. So you cannot compare one to the other and make them equal. Now, you could say, yes, we're the smaller group of people we find ourselves in this battle between larger states. That would be a little bit more accurate, but that's not how they look at it. The other, of course, obvious issue here is that they present themselves as these innocent victims of these two states that are sort of equal in battling it out, which is really not true. If you look at the level of collaboration, which varied a little bit in these three modern states, right? Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. But if let's have a look at Estonia, for instance. Estonia was actually officially declared Judenfrei, so free of the Jewish population. The only one of these three states in, I believe it was 1942. That is very significant. I think Croatia at one point also declared itself as a kind of smaller ally of Nazi Germany, but that was a debatable fact. The fact that Estonia was completely declared and sort of confirmed to be free of the Jewish population, that says a lot about not just the level of control of Nazi Germany, but also the level of collaboration in Estonia. Now, of course, even in a smaller, well, today again, I'll call it a country, right? Because it's an independent country today, nominally. Even there's going to be some, gradients. There's going to be some gray areas. There were some Estonians, let's say ethnic Estonians, that did support the Soviet Union. So if you look at the numbers of ethnic Estonians that were executed or killed, those numbers do exist. So it's not strictly the Jewish population or the Russian population, but you did have that level of collaboration. You did have, I believe, let me check, it's the 20th Waffen-SS division of Estonia. Now, there's that argument that it was not fully incorporated into the Wehrmacht and that not all volunteers volunteered. But ultimately, there's this division which did have volunteers, and some volunteers were definitely volunteers, right? So that's another issue. This is sort of the same issue with the Ukrainian First Galician, right, division in the Nazi German sort of army apparatus. The other thing, I'm going to completely butcher this name. I'm going to try to pronounce it. There was kind of this paramilitary organization in Estonia. It was called Omakaitse. I'm not sure how to pronounce it. I apologize if I'm butchering it. But basically, this organization predated the Nazi German occupation, and it was sort of known for its brutality even before the arrival of Nazi Germany. So these people were definitely very eager to cooperate with this so-called, occupying power. So you do have sort of that type of information that's definitely not going to be mentioned by the Estonian Ministry of Foreign Affairs in its tweet that's that if they're going to leave out Nazi Germany, why would they mention this type of collaborationism or the fact that Estonia was declared to be, Jew-free, right? So very, very significant type of information. I think they would be taken more seriously if they said, we're this small group of people, we're surrounded by larger, more powerful countries, we really do want to be independent, we don't want to have anything to do with the Russians, but also we don't want to have anything to do with the Swedes that controlled us at one point, with the Danes that controlled us at one point, with the Germans that controlled us at one point, during Nazi Germany time frame and before. But that's not what they say. They only focus on the Soviet Union. And they were also, of course, part of the Russian Empire at one point. So then you start asking questions, well, if it's an ideological issue, then why are you also talking about the Russian Empire that had a different ideology? And you're not talking about Germany, Denmark, and Sweden. Is it about having outside control, or is it more of being controlled by Europeans, or today by Americans, or whoever's running the world? Is it about that these Europeans are sort of higher on their perceived civilizational, sort of hierarchy, and then the Russians are lower, therefore it was bad to be controlled by Russia, the Russian Empire, again, different ideologically from the Soviet Union, but it was good to be controlled by Germany, Denmark, and Sweden. Which one is it, right? So if they were sort of more honest about the way that they presented things, I think they would be taken more seriously, at least by people who know all of these historic, maybe not nuances, but at least sort of general historic events that happened, let's say in the 1940s. So,
I mean, the way you presented this, if you were hired by the Estonian Foreign Ministry, you would have given them a perfect service. Sure. The way that you presented it, it makes sense, and it gives them, it sends a good message from Estonia, and also doesn't give a free service on a golden plate to Russia to come and say today that, look, how the Estonians are distorting history, or they are taking the history out of context. The thing is, I wanna just before I tell you the comment that I received about this, Estonia was confirmed that it was a Judenfrei, and the Nazi Germany didn't have any doubts about that. The last group of Jews that they executed were 4,500 Jewish people. This was in 1942. And Croatia, the Nazis didn't believe that they have what they called cleaned their countries from the Jewish people. They sent a messenger to Croatia to check if it's accurate or not. So this was when I was reading all this information, it horrified me the way they were treating the Jewish people back then, the anti-Semitism that they are now trying to project on other people, us in the Middle East, and calling us this anti-Semitic cause, right? And I received because I did I dived a little bit into history, and I prepared a video in the last live streaming about these cases. And one of the commentators said, sorry, an important topic, but you miss some important points. Estonia was attacked by Soviet Russia first in the 1940s. And when Soviet Russia was in pact with Germany, the Soviet Russians deported, raped, and killed tens of thousands of Estonians before Germany was attacking Soviet Russia and occupying Estonia in the process. That was the reason why Estonians welcomed the Germans as liberators, and many collaborated, and allied with Germany in the future events. History is complicated.
Well, like I said just now, I gave you an example of an organization that predated the entry of the Nazi German occupants to Estonia, that was happy to operate in very brutal ways in the Estonian territory anyway. So that kind of debunks it on its own. But whenever you have comments like that, the whole rape thing goes back to Goebbels' propaganda. I mean, I don't even know if we're allowed to use terms like that on YouTube, by the way, but if you were to, I can't claim that no soldier has ever done something like that, but the claim here is that it's coming from the top, that is being state ordered. If you look at some claims about other countries as well, and that simply isn't true. There was no directive coming from Stalin saying, go after women in such and such country, which is not to say that it may not have happened on some lower scale, because this is war. It happens, it may have happened, it happens everywhere, but it simply did not exist. And if you look at the root source of that information, it was literally coming from Goebbels himself. as far as that goes. So I would be very sort of skeptical about that particular comment. Now, as far as the whole Soviet situation goes, yes, the Soviet Union did enter the Baltic around this time, right, and sort of before Germany invaded the Soviet Union in 1941. But this was sort of, again, if you think about it, it was the context of these territories were part of the Russian Empire as well. So this was not a completely new sort of reconquest of lands that were completely independent. These states received a really highly amplified status coming out of the First World War. And what the Soviet Union was doing was, of course, trying to push the border as far from sort of the key areas in the Soviet Union as possible. Now, whether that's right or wrong, you can come to your own conclusion. It was doing sort of trying to do a similar thing with Finland, which is when what they call the Winter War, which is what we call the Soviet-Finnish War of, like the early 1940s broke out as well, because there was also that attempt to trade territories with Finland in an attempt to push the border farther away from Leningrad. And obviously that did not happen. And now we know what happened to Leningrad. So we know that Leningrad was under siege for almost 900 days with a death toll of, somewhere between 600,000 up to 1 million people from mostly starvation and diseases related to starvation. So you can kind of see that why the Soviet government was trying to do this, trade land from Finland for land from Russia in an attempt to push that border. So there was also sort of that side context going on as well. But the other issue with the Soviet Union is that another comment that comes from sort of the official talking heads coming from the Baltic is that much of the population or all of the population in the Baltic, the Russian population, came within the Soviet Union. Now, yes, there was internal migration within the Soviet Union from one republic to another, but there also, again, because these countries were part of or partially part of the Russian Empire, there were Russians there too. We can go back, like I said, Putin, go back to the 11th century, and you'll find some very ancient East Slavic settlements there. Not all of those settlements have survived, of course, but some of them are still historically documented as existent towns going back to the 14th century. So to exclusively claim that area to Estonians, Latvians, and Lithuanians is also inaccurate. There were other people there as well. So again, it goes with this twisting of history. If the Estonian Ministry of Foreign Affairs was a little bit more honest, not a little bit, really more honest about the way they're presenting things, saying, well, now we want to be completely free of this and this. We don't want to be controlled by Russians, but we also don't want to be controlled by Germans, by Swedes, by Danes, or by the Americans, by the way, which of course you would never hear that from them. If you go back to about 10 years ago, you would see all these news that were, you're thinking about here sort of the escalation to World War III, but really you had news about, NATO soldiers are marching 300 meters away from the Russian border. Guess which country that was? That was Estonia. They were in Narva. So you kind of had that escalation there too. So clearly you're not getting this sort of equal approach to who controls these smaller countries. You kind of have a hierarchy of bad people versus good overlords whose boots we're going to kiss. So that's kind of how I would represent it.
Yeah, guys, it goes without saying that all the relevant links of Nina, her X or formerly known Twitter, is in the description. Her website and also her YouTube channel are all in the description below. I want to ask you about the Leningrad siege, Nina, because when I was studying, and which lasted between 41 and 44, I realized that if I check the geography, then some of the reinforcement of the Nazi forces were coming from Estonia. And when the siege was broken on Leningrad, one of the first places, if I was a military strategist, that I would retreat and withdraw, if I was in the Nazi ranks, I would go to Tallinn, the city that they are now claiming that the Russians just bombed it for no reason. No reason. And the
Which
number
is not
of the
to say that civilians don't suffer in these contexts. I don't think anyone is saying that there isn't the civilian aspect.
The number,
of course, there is.
Yeah, the number of the civilian casualties when the Soviets bombed Tallinn was around 560 civilians, and compared to like a million,
bombings of Dresden and certain other places, Tokyo.
Yeah. And in Leningrad, the numbers are horrifying, right? We are talking about 1 million deaths, many from
Yeah, I think the
starvation and.
official estimates were, which nowadays historians say they're probably higher. The official
Mhm,
estimates are around 600,000, and most of
mhm,
those, I think there was only 3% from actual shellings,
mhm,
but most of them were from starvation and starvation related illnesses. And yes, some Estonians were part of the Finnish units that were aiding Nazi Germany in the siege, basically.
yeah.
And that sort of is, one obvious comment that doesn't get mentioned. But Finland is obviously also kind of an interesting situation, because at the beginning of the war it was sort of aiding Nazi Germany. At the end of the war it was not aiding Nazi Germany. So there was that. And of course, the Finnish leader Mannerheim used to be a famous military leader within the Russian imperial forces, which is why, and he lived in St. Petersburg for quite some time, which is why prior to the siege, some people in the Soviet government could not believe that someone who was so loyal to Russia would do something that would harm civilians first and foremost, and he did. And as a side note, he's sort of officially considered a hero in Finland for many reasons, but he is sort of this. I mean, other than of course the brutality of deliberately cutting off more than 1 million civilians, right, in a city. Well, some people were able to flee a city like St. Petersburg. But I did want to mention this as kind of like putting on my tinfoil hat, that
Mhm,
not everyone considers him a hero. I think in the mid 2000s, Finland itself released an animation movie, and you guys are welcome to Google it for those of you
mhm,
that like
mhm,
conspiracy hats and tinfoil hats. I think it's called in English, The Butterfly of the Urals, like the Ural Mountains. And basically, it's exploring what seems to be documented, that Mannerheim seemed to have a penchant for, how do I say this without getting kicked off of YouTube,
mhm,
for
mhm,
underage males. And
mhm,
that's what that animated movie coming from Finland itself is about. So he also had this kind of darker personal side, that's, is a little bit not very fitting for a Finnish hero. But you
mhm,
guys are welcome to Google it.
mhm,
It's even mentioned on our favorite resource, the Wikipedia. So, but yeah, I mean, that's if you look at the starvation of the civilians of Leningrad, at the lowest point, people were getting rations. People who were not laborers, it was 125 grams of bread a day. And bread
mhm.
wasn't like nice bread that you're going to go to the grocery store. It had all kinds of additives like glue that was made of animal parts. So the
Wow.
fact that people even managed to, I mean, they would eat leather, they would eat
Mhm,
grass, they would eat things that you're not supposed to eat, just to get through and somehow end up on the other side of this. So this is another aspect that you're saying that's not
yes.
mentioned about the Estonian participation in sort of in the Finnish military efforts. The Finnish part of the siege, which is more known, but it's sort of not mentioned by by these ministries of foreign affairs for sure. And of
Yeah.
course, the massive civilian death toll in
Yeah.
Leningrad.
Guys, as Goran Snow says, smash that like button. Thank you. It really helps with the algorithm of YouTube, with the suppression that exists nowadays and is dominating over the alternative journal media outlets, or the journalists who are trying to show the other side of the story. While I also trying to dig into the history, I found out that in Estonia, Lithuania, and Ukraine, there are hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of stones and memories of the former Nazi collaborators. They
And
are their
grave
statues,
marches.
marches, torches, and everything. I thought this is exclusive to Ukraine, and it turned out that it's also in Estonia, and the Jewish communities were protesting against it, and nothing has happened. There were investigations started, but never seen a light, never came into
Well, I think
conclusions.
it's very interesting because these countries exist within the framework of the European Union.
Yeah.
And I know the European Union doesn't have a unified policy regarding this, but Kevork, you live in Germany. You know
Mm,
what laws regarding, even displaying certain symbols are like in
mhm,
Germany.
mhm,
You would get a prison sentence. So it's very interesting that the European Union kind of just lets well, the Baltics can do whatever they want with these, parades and marches of the remaining volunteers, right, in the SS divisions in these Baltic countries, or the memory thereof. So it's definitely, yes, like you're saying, it's not just a Ukrainian problem. And sometimes you have these people come out and say, well, Russia had Vlasovites, right? It had its own sort of collaboration element, but Russia, or the Soviet Union and modern Russia, was very clear. These people were executed. These people do not, their descendants do not have marches, right? They were executed. So it's a very different way of looking at collaboration. But I think it goes farther than that. I mean, as far as if you look at the European Union and the way it lets the Baltic countries get away with things that other countries in the core of the European Union would not get away with. I mean, if you look at the so-called non-citizens, Russian non-citizens in the Baltic states, right? They lived there. They lost, obviously, due to the dissolution of the Soviet Union. They lost their citizenship. They were not allowed to gain the citizenship, or were not able to gain the citizenship of their respective Baltic states. So they're not completely stateless. They do have some documentation about the fact that they're alive. They do, I believe, have an internal passport, but they're second-rate citizens. They're not allowed to vote. They're not allowed to travel to some places. And the European Union just kind of allows the existence of these non-citizens. Again, a very large percentage of the population. I don't think every single Russian in these states is a non-citizen, but a significant percentage is. And again, just to kind of go back, there is a significant percentage of ethnic Russians in those states, or at least the ones who self-declare, or maybe Russophones. They might not be ethnic Russians, Russophones, somewhere, I think for, let's say, Estonia, somewhere between 20 and 30%, a little bit lower for the other, Latvia and Lithuania. So that's interesting. And it goes even farther because, of course, these people do not have the linguistic rights that the European Union says minorities are supposed to have in terms of their education, in terms of having access to government services. Other European Union countries are supposed to follow these rules, but somehow the Baltic states do not, and no one seems to care within the European Union. So, of course, we know the European Union is a sort of an interesting super state in terms of its enforcement of laws very selectively, and trying to punish countries within itself, like Hungary, when it seems to be sort of out of bounds within the sort of general policy, et cetera, et cetera. So I think this sort of the parades for these Nazi collaborationists and the suppression of the Russian minorities, whether linguistically, whether as second-rate non-citizens, is really, really interesting. And it's also very interesting because, again, these countries claim to be these smaller people that were oppressed by multiple larger states, and at the same time, they're oppressing their own minorities in sort of the broad daylight. And I think recently, since 2022, there are all these sort of quasi-rumors in the media that some of these Russians are even going to be deported, and where are they going to be deported because they're non-citizens, which is, again, like, you're deporting people for their minority status. Is really just kind of outrageous if you think about the time frame that we're living in, and of course, again, parallel to the 1940s. So that's another thing. So if you're so poor and oppressed and you're always a victim, why are you oppressing these smaller people within your ranks, basically?
Yeah, actually, there was something also very interesting. For example, a few weeks ago, I mean, this was during the Corona times. There was a satirist here in Germany, in Berlin, actually. He drew a cartoon, or he drew the cover of his book, comparing the masking to the era of Nazism here in Germany, and they took him to the court.
I remember that.
And then you have the there was a Ukrainian singer in Munich who was singing for the younger Ukrainian refugees, and he was singing for Bandera. And Bandera's graveyard is here, also in Germany. And the MI6 actually hired him after the World War II to wage what they call resistance against the Soviet Union back then. So Oni was saying, just look at the nations in Europe that had USA's support after 1991. They are all ex-Nazi collaborators. Actually, it started even after World War II. And I mean, from a pragmatical point of view, the Americans wanted to weaponize these Nazis against the Soviet Union.
Well,
They weaponized.
much like the moderate rebels in various parts of
Exactly,
the Middle East.
exactly. The Islamists, like the Islamism and this Nazism, may pose a threat to the national security inside the United States. But if you can weaponize them against your enemies, then I mean, I don't want to say that's a smart move, but that's something very, very dirty politics, in my opinion, in this regard.
Well, if
And
you
now
look at the Second Chechen War, I always kind of view it as a precursor to the Syrian situation because there were militants literally from dozens of countries, like Saudi Arabia, coming to Chechnya. There were not ethnic Chechens that were, fighting Russians. There were definitely sort of the most extreme elements, and some of these militant leaders were coming from somewhere else that had a particular ideology. And then when you start asking where were they getting the money to do what they were engaging in, that is a very interesting question. And you can go back to some of the recent Putin interviews to which he alludes to some of these events in his own statements. You're welcome to check it for yourself. Yeah. So this weaponization within liberalism, right? This ideology that is supposed to be about tolerance and about rainbows and kittens and all the good things, is at the same time is able to weaponize some of these really darker movements without giving them sort of this amplification where they're able to exist on their own. They wouldn't be, but their usefulness in terms of sort of fighting their enemies or perceived enemies has definitely been shown. The Banderites in Ukraine existed for another decade after World War II, and of course Khrushchev ended up releasing thousands of them out of prisons, unlike Stalin, and without any kind of ideological re-education. And of course, that's another questionable thing to what extent it would work. But this was the time when the Soviet Union was trying to mend relations with West Germany within the Cold War, and so that was one of the sort of gestures of goodwill, is releasing all of these Banderites. And of course, then they were sort of incorporated into local party organs. They were very good communists up until the collapse of the Soviet Union, and then they went back to basically practicing what they were practicing, or what their forefathers were practicing during World War II. So that's definitely, I think the Bandera thing is very interesting, because he was essentially extracted and saved by, what is it, Otto Skorzeny. I'm probably mispronouncing his name. So some really high-ranking officials coming from the Third Reich to get him and basically to save him. And then, of course, then he was used by other intelligence services as he lived a very nice life in Munich with his family. And then, of course, his family, his descendants ended up in Toronto, Canada, which when I realized that at one point I lived in Toronto and his grandson lived in Toronto, I mean, I've never seen him. We've now seen him on social media, but that just kind of blew my mind, that there's this guy who's actually named after him. He has the same name, and it's anglicized. It's Stephen, right? But he is his descendant, and he's having a very nice life in Toronto, Canada. And here's Nina Byzantina running around and living in Toronto as well. It's just absolutely, it was kind of like one of these historical jokes, right? Historical jokes, yeah.
This in Canada, it seems they are collecting this former. Collecting, also taking in the white helmets and
I know they love their full spectrum of rebels, quote unquote.
I have so many. I know people who used to work in humanitarian work, and they're helping the so-called rebels from Lebanon in Syria, and they go to the embassy of Canada, and they present their case, and they get political asylum right away to Canada from Beirut, and in a few weeks they are already in Canada, and that happens so many times. Since we're speaking about these very important cases, I mean, nowadays we see that France is proposing or saying that sending troops to Ukraine is not off the table, at least from what I understood. And Baltic countries are very much excited about this, which really puzzles me, because they're the ones, if God forbidden war erupts, they're going to be
the ones that have historically, according to them themselves, have been stuck between larger states, right, fighting it out according to their own sort of perception of history. So the fact that they're sort of, they're very much cheering and saber rattling in their official statements when they're sort of the ones right next to Russia, that is, a nuclear armed country is really kind of shocking. But I think that that whole idea that you're just poking the bear that is nuclear armed, and Russia has been showing all this restraint. And I think some of these European leaders have gotten kind of complacent, thinking we can just keep doing this. And, like I am I love Russia and I'm Russian, but I don't live in Russia. I live in North America. I kind of would prefer not to be nuked by Russia in this context. So, so I think we all, like those of us who do not have bunkers, which is most of the population, would prefer for it not to go this way. But at some point, it's one of these things that if you think about the history of the Cold War, how close all of the close calls, not just the Cuban Missile Crisis, but the accidental pressing of the famous red button that almost happened. There are all of those close calls. And so I think maybe that nuclear danger is a little bit smaller than some people who like to exaggerate it, but it's not non-existent. And when you're now officially speaking about sending NATO troops to Ukraine, of course, we sort of suspected, and someone like our favorite Polish politician Radek Sikorski has confirmed that they're in Ukraine. They've been there forever. They're actually not doing this and that. There's a reason why this type of information is being publicly, like you said, someone makes the decision to publicly state it. Someone makes the decision to sort of state the obvious. So there's something going on behind the scenes, and to me, it's a little bit confusing, because on the one hand, there seems to be less and less funding going to Ukraine, which is why Zelensky is, trying to beg more and more for to fund his various mansions around the world, in my opinion. But I have to qualify it as my opinion. But at the same time, you kind of have this no funding. We're not able to produce all the, artillery shells. We're not able to keep up with the Russian production. We're only producing a third of what Russia produces. But at the same time, we have the, Macron saber rattling of, oh, yes, we're going to send French troops. So something is going on behind the scenes, and I think it can be interpreted in different ways. It can be interpreted as, well, we just want to gauge the Russian reaction to this, or it can be interpreted as the truth. And then, of course, there's a whole spectrum of how we can interpret this in other ways as well.
Actually, this is very interesting, because I was reading to Kuleba, for example, the foreign minister of Ukraine, and this is what he had to say in this regard, and especially because this was in the context of sending troops to Ukraine, and they were speaking about Germany, and they say, although Germany is by far the largest European military aid donor to Ukraine, it has come under fierce pressure for its reluctance to send Kiev long-range Soros cruise missiles for fear of provoking Moscow. But Kuleba took a subtle sweep at he was criticizing Germany here, and he said, I'm personally fed up with the fear of escalation. He said, our problem is that we still have people who think of this war in terms of the fear of escalation. Kuleba continued, what kind of escalation are you afraid of? What else has to happen to Ukraine for you to understand that this fear is useless? What do you expect Putin to do? Well, I sent tanks, but I didn't send the missiles or troops, so maybe you will be nicer to me than to others. That's not how Putin thinks. That's not how he treats Europe. It strikes me this because I feel like, how can he say this? How can he think that his country is a player? He's not a player anymore. He has become a pawn to NATO. So he cannot really dare.
It's basically a terrain to test NATO weapons, right? It's a terrain for let's call them questionable financial operations, where not all the money is being accounted for. That is going to Ukraine, just insane amounts that we've never seen before. I mean, it's hard to imagine the billions, just the sheer number that has gone there, and how much of it was actually used for its purpose is, very questionable in my opinion, and the opinion of some. I think even some mainstream media sources try to publish this, and then remember they had to pull this information. The first source of only 30% goes to Ukraine actually ends up in Ukraine, and then they had to issue massive apologies and change change their articles and videos, which is pretty fascinating. The pressure that came afterwards. But be that as it may, well, obviously the death toll in Ukraine is shocking, right? If you think about the number of men that were wasted to defend, the Avdiivkas and Bakhmuts, right?
Yes.
Just for the show, or any of these attempted incursions into Belgorod in Russia, where they end up being killed before they even get in there, and it's this supposed PR stunt, which ends up just needlessly wasting lives, just shockingly, just to have some kind of a statement in the media that they try to, or they may have, succeeded entering Belgrade for a few seconds. I mean, that alone is insane. But at the same time, you wouldn't have our friend and favorite gynecologist Ursula and a whole slew of European leaders flying to Kiev if they were actually terrified of being struck by Russia. They would not be going there. They would be very, very much sitting in their bunkers. So the fact that Russia is not just obliterating Kiev, for instance, and some of these other cities, and these European leaders are able to fly there repeatedly and have their little photo ops next to the one bomb building, right, says a lot about the limits of that war and what Russia does and doesn't do in terms of, it's clearly not using the types of methods than the American military used in Iraq, for instance, right? It's not this complete bombing campaign of civilian infrastructure. So that's one thing. But yeah, the fact that Kuleba thinks of himself as part of Europe and as actually sort of being able to pull the strings. I mean, I guess to a certain extent they do, because they're able to get money. But at the same time, they're basically being used as this geopolitical NATO mattress for whatever purposes the powers that be have for Ukraine. So it's a little bit of an inflated. Well, I mean, I think once you sort of feed this little this little monkey with a grenade a little too much, the monkey with a grenade becomes a little bit more arrogant about its status, and without actually looking at the fate of the previous leaders that had similar status, and then they're discarded.
I prepared a very short video about this exact topic that we are discussing now. I will play this video and I will ask you one last question. Okay, let's watch this video together.
Sometimes I get the impression that Western diplomats lack a deep understanding of the implications of their statements. It remains uncertain to me whether this stems from their incompetence or a deliberate intention to provoke their opponent in Moscow. Take, for instance, the remark made by a European diplomat: "We must provide Ukraine with everything necessary to defeat Russia." Does this diplomat truly comprehend the magnitude of the term everything? Everything means sending fighter jets to Ukraine that could carry tactical nuclear weapons. It also means sending NATO ground troops and the potential for significant escalation and direct confrontation between the transatlantic alliance and Russia. Now the question is, who could be interested in such a risky escalation? The answer lies in identifying who is losing the war and is in dire need of outside help to avoid total collapse. And here comes the recent statements of French politicians that they are building an alliance of countries open to potentially sending Western troops to Ukraine. Germany, despite being the largest European military aid donor to Ukraine, has faced intense pressure for its justified reluctance to provide Kiev with long-range Taurus cruise missiles for fear of provoking Moscow into a direct clash. You would think every diplomat would agree with the German position, but Ukraine's foreign minister, who hasn't realized yet that he doesn't own the keys of the war and his country has become nothing but a pawn for NATO, has criticized his biggest European donor and said he is fed up with the German reluctance and fear of escalation. Mr. Kuleba, I live in Germany and my taxpayer money is going against my will to finance your war effort against Russia. This is your war, not mine. You brought this upon yourself with your stupid decisions and mistakes. Why would we here pay the price now and fight your war? If you're fed up with the German reluctance for escalation, we are fed up with your big mouth spewing nothing but ungratefulness and provocations to bring the entire European continent into a destructive war. It's crazy how none of these diplomats, whose job is to encourage negotiations, is not saying a word about diplomacy when behind closed doors, their military officials are saying a Ukrainian military victory now seems impossible, and the gravest error of analysis and judgment would be to continue to seek exclusive military solutions to stop the hostilities.
I mean, any objective observer and analyst knows that Ukraine is on the path for a defeat in their own country, and this is an unfortunate truth because they could have saved a lot if they agreed for a peace agreement at the beginning of the war. But
That was
now we
one of
have.
the worst peace agreements for Russia that I have seen. So it's actually shocking that they haven't agreed to it. It was probably as bad as the 1918 Brest-Litovsk agreement between the Bolsheviks and Germany, where the Bolsheviks just ceded a lot of land to Germany to focus on fighting the White Army and their supporters. So when I saw when the Washington Post published the terms of that agreement, it was shockingly bad for Russia. So the fact that Ukraine didn't agree to that is quite telling. Now we of course don't know the extent of the Western pressure, right? As far as Boris Johnson's troop there came and so on and so forth, but it's still very telling.
Yeah. Do you share my sentiments that Europe is in danger and Russia is trying to tell the Europeans that you're crossing the red lines now, and with the leak that they published, this leak of the discussion between the German officers, this was, in my opinion, a warning to Germany and other European powers that they are listening and they know the plans behind closed doors. And if similar weapons are sent to Ukraine, or their infrastructure are hit, like the Kerch, for example, bridge, or if they send NATO troops to Ukraine, then this is going to be considered a major escalation. In your opinion, what's the red line of Russia here? I mean, we're speaking about a red line that could lead into a major outbreak of a war between the both sides, NATO and Russia.
I think that danger is definitely there. So it's a little bit complicated. So the war in Donbass began in 2014, and as part of that war, which of course NATO was training the Ukrainian troops. It was modernizing their army. We've heard, from Merkel and Hollande that the Minsk agreements were a sham. It was just to buy some time to arm Ukraine. So all of this was happening. And as part of that war, there were a number of incidents where there were, I believe, incursions into official Russian territory by Ukrainian troops, shots being fired there. And every time I thought Russia was going to do something because that was an act of war. Russia did nothing, which is why I think a lot of commentators were surprised that in 2022, Russia finally did something after 8 years of putting up with what was being done to the ethnic Russians or Russophones in Donbass, and what was being done otherwise in terms of the military buildup around it. So much like here, I know a lot of commentators have been saying, well, Russia claimed this was a red line, but then it didn't do anything. And then Russia claimed that was a red line and it didn't do anything. But much like the escalation of Donbass, where nothing happened and all of a sudden we went to the not the full-scale entry, but the partial entry into Ukraine in February 2022, there might be another situation where people are sort of getting complacent and European leaders are thinking, well, the Kerch Bridge has been struck, this many times now and nothing has happened. Well, they blew up Nord Stream, but nothing has happened. At some point, there might be a red line that we're not even thinking of that is going to be the trigger for a larger conflict. And obviously, so far, Russia has shown restraint. So from the Russian perspective, it's not so much about crossing red lines. It's about not escalating to an all-out conflict, which could then be a global conflict because there are multiple nuclear armed powers involved. So this is where the danger is, right? Because I think the European politicians have gotten very complacent with Russia sort of stating this is our red line, but nothing happens. But something did happen in 2022, and something might happen as a result of some of these latest actions, whether in the Black Sea, or whether with these incursions into Belgrade, or whether there is another type of, let's say, fighter jet that's being provided to Ukraine. Any of those things can be, I remember you saying that these fighter jets on their own are not relevant. It's the fact that they can be armed with nuclear weapons, right? This is the issue, where this is how Russia is going to interpret their flight, that they may be carrying nuclear missiles toward Russia. And that might be the trigger, right? So of course there is that danger. I'm not sure, I can't really measure it in terms of the Cold War doomsday clock, but it's definitely a possible escalation, a serious escalation is possible. And I'm just not sure if Europeans the normal sort of ordinary, regular Europeans in Europe, not the talking heads in the EU Parliament or the unelected leaders of the EU, really sort of understand how quickly this could escalate and how badly it can end for lots
Yes.
of people.
And for us,
Exactly,
for the
for us.
ordinary people as well, living
Right.
in this continent. My true intentions are to show the other side of the story, which is something blocked and not listened and not heard in Europe. I want to create a bridge between the like try to bring the narratives from the other side so that it could facilitate in understanding what's happening from both sides. Because when you block the other side of the narrative completely, you're also this is coming with a package of demonizing and Russophobia and etc. etc. And those are all preliminary phases for going into war against Russia. And I don't want war between Russia and Europe or between Russia and the United States. This affects us all, whether we are living in Europe or not. Affects in the Middle East, affects everyone around the world. The global economy will be shaken completely. People will face starvation. And yeah, there's so many things that is going to happen. Just last comment about this, that the red line of Russia, in my opinion, is also, it depends on the timing. You could do the same act today and Russia doesn't act, but then in 2 years, Russia acts. And this was something that I learned from one of the commentators when they would, because there was this discussion why Russia didn't intervene in 2014 to try to save the people in Donbass, etc., etc. And some of the people were saying, raising some very important questions, that if Russia did this in 2014, their economy would have been completely
Right. Russia was definitely not economically ready for that. I mean, it's
Yes.
one of those hindsight questions that
Yeah.
the type of sanctions that have been implemented recently would have really damaged it
Exactly.
much more than having those 8 years to prepare for it. And of course, having that possible transfer to more of a wartime economy, which Russia has partially done, in mind as well. So I think, yeah, you're right. Timing is definitely another factor here. It's not just a red line as a hypothetical statement, don't do this thing. It's more about the, you know, the continuum in and the sort of the dynamism of events as well. So
Yeah. My prayers goes for peace, really. Genuinely, I would love to see a rising multipolarity that can protect also the people in the global south from continuous subjugation from the whether European powers or from American powers. There has to be an alternative, because the current existing one, it's not working for the entire globe. It's only working for a fraction of the people, and it's not even working for the majority of the people in their own countries. It's working for very tiny people in their own countries. So I think a change is really important, but I hope this change would come without war. Nina, thank you so much, really, for your great insight and for contribution to
thank you
this
for having me.
literature. It's a great pleasure to have you all the time, always. And we will be doing a follow-up, hopefully in a few weeks, when something new arises in this exact context. And let's see if Estonian Foreign Minister will post something ridiculous again, so we can comment on that later. Guys, thank you very much. Yeah,
I'm sure
guys,
they will.
there will be some other countries as well. Guys, thank you so much for tuning in today. Really, I appreciate you all. Tomorrow at 5 p.m. Central European time, Nina told me that the time has changed in the United States. I don't know. I think it's going to be at 12, then midnight Eastern American time. Tomorrow we are going to be with Professor Jamal Wakim, and he's a geopolitical expert, and we're going to discuss the Middle East and Ukraine again. So peace be upon you and upon your families. Salam.